Warm welcome back to the channel, guys. So what we are in the midst of doing at the moment is still working on the engine. So we've just been cleaning up some of the ancillaries for this, giving the tinware a bit of a paint over, primed the engine bay as you've seen in some of the previous videos. Need to be taking the generator off and cleaning that, fuel pump, mounts, etc. We have cleaned and rebuilt the carburetor, throttle linkage, etc. So what we're going to be looking at doing tonight is rebuilding the starter motor. Now, this is not actually the starter motor from this car. This is sort of a hodgepodge of parts from two starter motors, one from this car and one from the blue one, and I sort of swapped them all together to build one functioning one to get that other car running. But the problem with this is kind of twofold that we're going to fix today. First of all, we'll have a look at this when this comes off. The contacts on the switch here are broken. The way this works is that's a switch there that will energize the motor, but when you pull the starter lever, what you do is you actually pull this lever and it kicks out the Bendix drive, which engages with the flywheel at the same time as it's spinning the motor over. And the problem with this is this one here, the bushes have ovaled ever so slightly at the front. They've worn, which allowed this Bendix, or allowed this armature to wobble around, I should say, and the Bendix drive here has chewed most of its teeth off against the flywheel. So this no longer works properly. One, because it doesn't really make contact properly, so very seldom actually spins over. And secondly, when it does spin over, the armature wobbles, this doesn't make contact with the flywheel, and when it does, it doesn't have any teeth to actually spin it over. So I have a whole bunch of replacement parts here that we're going to use. We've got some bushes, and for the front and the rear I've got some new brushes, just it's worth changing them. I've got a new switch and I've got a new Bendix drive. It's sitting on my trusty old bench vise because I'm going to be using this to actually push out the original bushes and drive the new ones in.
Yeah, sure. Oh, good.
When you do dismantle the starter, do watch out for these. These are insulators, little insulating sleeves on there. You can replace them, don't lose them, otherwise the whole thing will short out. But we'll do this just to take the front section apart. The Bendix just sits, or rather this sits over a section of the Bendix drive there to actually throw it forwards. It's a bit of a faff to get out, but we can sort of wobble it out like that. And we can see this here, the, get that in the camera vaguely, the worn chipped teeth on there. Just compare that to the new one. Which is clearly a better shape. Now if you're buying parts to do this yourself, do watch out that you get FLR parts or FL parts, certainly the 126, and anything that has the starter in a different location probably has a different ring gear and therefore a different shape on the Bendix. So I'm not 100% sure whether R and 126 parts will fit, but it's easy enough to get the complete correct ones, so do watch out for that. That will be going in there. Now what we've got is a selection of bushes here. Two of them are for, well, one of them's for the front here, one of them's for the rear. That one's actually fine, so we're not going to be replacing it. And one of them is designed to go into the Bendix itself. Now as we've got a complete new one, we are not going to need this bush here, which is actually the one for going into there, which you drive in if you were just refurbishing a starter motor that didn't need this part replacing. So what we've got here are the ones that go into the ends. You can see they size up and they fit correctly in there. Now what I'm going to do is actually use the new bush to press out the old bush, which is going to involve a little bit of setting up in the bench vise, and I will just pause this for a second whilst I do that, get that set up, ready to go. I stopped that because this is an ancient vise and no one really wants to see 10 minutes of me trying to unwind the jaws. So you can see what I've done is I've set it up here with this clamped in. There is the bush, and I've actually just started to crank it to begin to drive the old one out there. So as I continue to do this, you will see it doesn't wobble off camera too much. You will see the old bush being driven out here, and again obviously every time we go round, drive that further out. I do recommend you mount your bench vise to a bench instead of trying to do this every time, but I haven't really got a bench big enough or solid enough to do that, so we'll make do. And there you go, the old bush has popped out and fallen somewhere on the floor. Oh no, there it is. So that was the one that was kind of ovaled, causing us some issues, and this here is the new one, which is now set in there like that. If I hadn't been gassing away, that would have been done in about half the time. And we can see, just testing that there, reverse mounting that, that is, there's no play in there, so we are good. Now before I reassemble it, let's have a look at what the problem with this part was here. So we'll just take this off. Now the actual brass contact, copper contact I should say, on there is good. In here, however, they have been burnt out. I've flipped them over a couple of times and tried to sort of re-square them, but they're not great. So it's difficult to see on the camera there, but there's quite a lot of pitting on both of those contacts. So again, we have a replacement part here. Which, as you can see, no pitting. So that's good. Again, what happens here is as that button is depressed, that contact makes contact with that one there, which makes contact with that one there, and actually spins the motor over. So we will assemble that and we'll put that back on there as the final thing before we test it. So I'm going to get this ready to reassemble, I will check the brushes, although they look kind of okay, so I don't know whether I'll bother changing them this time. And then we will give it a quick test. So first thing I've done is drive the retaining pin out of here to give me a little bit of free space, which should enable me to install the new Bendix drive in here a lot easier than when the pin was in there. Bit of a faff trying to do this one-handed with one eye on the camera. We've got that in there to get the spring back in. Oh, let's just stop that for a second. Now, losing that spring from there was possibly the most annoying thing I've managed to do so far, because it's a right faff to get back in. But we finally got it lined up and got the pin driven through, which means we've now got the Bendix sitting in there. The spring mechanism works and springs back, so we can now begin installing it to the shaft on the starter motor here. Now there's a keyway on there, and there's like a Woodruff drive in there, which needs to be lined up. So we'll line those two up to make sure that that sits correctly on there. And then what we can do is align the bush at the front with the nose of the armature to make sure that that sits correctly in there and is not going to wobble about. And then it's a case of lining up the rest of the slots here. Now you'll notice that it only fits in one way, and this is for a starter that is mounted on the top of the bell housing, so it sits like this, and the cable pushes it or rather pulls it down here to spin it out and engage it. The ones that sit in different places on the 126 and so on look slightly different. Now, before I put these back in, got to remember to put the insulation over the top of them, otherwise we'll get them shorting out and the whole thing won't work. So I'll put those over there, and it will be at this precise moment I realise that these had to be installed before these go through. Yep, exactly as I expected, so I'm going to have to just pop the end off there again, and this time we'll make sure we do this in this way. We'll do it reverse, put the screw through from the bottom, without the insulation on. Again, trying to do this one-handed, it's not too easy. It's all starting to slide apart. So we'll go like that. And again, this is just to stop this from making contact anywhere. We'll slide that on, and we'll slide the other one on. That should now work once it's back together. Again, we'll just make sure we've got the Woodruff key in the right place as this all goes back down together. He says trying to keep it on camera at the same time as doing that. Nope, you know what, I'm going to need both hands. Let's just pause that for a sec. So all through, we'll just tighten up the nuts on the end. I'll put some anti-vibration nylock nuts on here. Which just mean that in the position where the starter is, it's going to be spinning around, and we don't want it to cause too much in the way of sort of vibration issues. Or have anything coming undone. So there we go, one starter motor, Bendix drive there. That will throw that out to make contact with the flywheel. And what I'll do is I will mount the new switch onto the top there, so it sits that way round, so that part makes contact with that there. And what we'll be able to do then, once that's in place, is we'll be able to connect it to 12 volts and we will test it. Okay, so we've got it wired into a battery, just your negative to earth there and positive, and we can just spin the motor over there, and we can test the Bendix drive works there. A little bit noisy, but it is actually working properly. So complete. If you've enjoyed this, if you've enjoyed some of the technical articles, please feel free to give us a like, give us a subscribe, or leave me any comments.